On to our next presentation, and this is from the industry perspective, and we're delighted to have with us Dr. Shah, who's the Global Study Associate Director of AstraZeneca Pharma here in Poland. Ekta, welcome to you. And could I just say, while Ekta's taking her place, that we would have started off with a patient, but various circumstances, which we'll come to later, have meant that we're not doing that. So for patients amongst you, particularly in our online audience, patients are always first here at ECRIN, but unfortunately circumstances have intervened that have meant a bit of a shuffle round. So with that, Ekta, over to you.
Thank you. Okay. So today in this few minutes, I would be presenting the industry perspective of decentralized clinical trial. Just a disclaimer here, I work for AstraZeneca, but currently the opinion that I would be presenting would be my opinion and not those of AstraZeneca. Of course, I bring in the industry experience as well here. Okay, I'm going to start with some basic context setting here. So drug development, as it was already discussed during the initiation of this forum. So from the sponsor perspective, drug development is a big R&D cost. It's like, I read a report and overall it states that, $2.6 billion for one drug development. And when there is a delay to it, we see that, the sponsor bleeds, like in terms of the cost, it can go up to like $6,000 per day. So that's the kind of loss that happens if there is a delay in the trial. So coming back to the drug development, so the sponsor has to have that fine balance between, time taken against the patients, as well as, the other side, the important side of it is the delayed access to life-changing medicine for the patient. So this is something that we need to balance between, the R&D cost. We have already seen that, there is so many clinical trials ongoing. It's a crowded marketplace, I would say. But at the same time, whenever we do the clinical trial, there are three important parameters that we need to follow. One is patient centricity. This is a buzzword in the industry now about patient centricity, but yes, patient safety and patient comes first is what we understand. Safety of the drug is really important, and we need to follow the regulations is what we know. With that, I would also want to give some statistics here. So the typical clinical trials that we are doing, we have noticed, and we have some numbers here, we have noticed that this is burdensome for the patients and sites, like everything happening at the site. What happens is for the patients, it's frequent travel is inaccessible, big time commitment, time of the work that they will have to give, and there is limited communication between sites, or maybe sometimes too much communication in terms of follow-up. So what we have realized is the patients at almost 70% of the patients live more than 2 hours for each visit, as we have realized. And in 50% of clinical trial participants find it difficult to stay enrolled because of the lengthy procedures, and they do not have their health, there's a poor health condition, and that is why there are patients coming for the trials. Again, 85% of trials fail to retain enough patients. By the time the trial ends, we see there is a lot of loss to follow up. Patients do not want to continue. So this is something that are observed, that are the things that we have observed with the clinical trial. Coming to the sponsor perspective of it, we have realized that there is only 3% of eligible patients across the world that we are able to join the clinical trials. There is more than 50% of dropout in any given trial that we see at this point of time. Another important perspective is the racial and ethnic group that we have is very less. There is inclusion of 2 to 16% of clinical trial population. So this is what we have noticed. And most of the time, the data that we capture, that is 90% of the time, it is limited to the clinic or limiting to the disease understanding and treatment. With that context, as we know, what are the elements of the successful trial? We need the right patients. We need to dispense and randomize the patients the right way. We need to adhere to the regulations, the GCP, the CSP, and ensure availability of data and the accuracy of data. With this context, I will now talk about the decentralized clinical trial. So with the information that we saw, decentralized clinical trials does answer to this concern in a lot of ways. So this is not a new concept to start with. So DCT is not entirely new. I remember 5 years back as well, we had the workshop about, what can be introduced into DCT, what are the elements that we can have. So there were a lot of plannings at the sponsor end, and that really helped. When the COVID came, we could implement those strategies, is how I would say. So it's not new, but just COVID triggered the conversation. And right now what we see, I have put up one graph here, if you can have a look here. So this is the graph or the information that I have pulled up from the McKinsey report. And what it states, this is more about physicians' comfort with remote technology has increased as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. So there are 3 categories of the investigators that we have seen. It's like oncologist, the neurologist, and the cardiac specialist. And we have seen the interaction with the patient. If you see, compare, the A is the pre-COVID exposure, B is the COVID exposure, and C, what you see is the post-COVID exposure. So we did see the whole spike during the COVID times, but after the COVID, we have seen that, it's not at the same momentum, it has gone down. So it's not just the industry, in the investigator exposure, I would say. This is something from the sponsor perspective as well. Like during the COVID times, we had implemented a lot of decentralized strategies, but post-COVID, what we did was we did try to return to a lot of basic, typical trials that we do. And, so this is what I just wanted to highlight. Like, this is something similar, like, the work from home culture that we had during the COVID. It was like, oh, this is going to be the future. We are always going to work from home. But people are returning back to office. This is the something similar trend we see as a sponsor as well with our decentralized approach, I would say. So these are the few components of the DCT that we see, like, direct-to-patient medication, e-consent, the patient app, ECOA, telemedicine, sensors, wearables. The future is digital biomarker and the clinician rating as well, which is very niche right now. It's to be explored. So there are 2 ways that we can look at this decentralization. One is fully decentralized, wherein everything happens virtually, and the other one is hybrid, wherein only few components are added to the complex procedure. So this is how we see there are 2 categories how we are implementing DCT currently. So coming to the implementation of DCT from the sponsor perspective. So technology is just a part of the process. We know there is a e-consent option available. We know there is a e-pro consent option available. So there are various options, but not everything fits for every trial is what we have realized. And there are a lot of brainstorming that happens before even implementing the DCT. So the 3 pillars that needs to be taken care of while you are going to implement the DCT, one of them from the protocol perspective or the study perspective is to understand the trial complexity and study specific requirements. Which aspect of the study can get simplified. And specifically that we have spoken about is the impact on the endpoints. That's very essential to understand whether we can implement the DCT in the study. And also the visit requirements, not that, as we previously discussed, not every visit can be turned into the virtual visits. Example, in the oncology study, like chemotherapy has to be given to the patient and the patient has to come to the on-site. So every study will have a different components and not everywhere we can implement all of the aspects is what we have realized right now. So there has to be a careful brainstorming that we see that needs to be done. The second aspect to it is patient centricity, of course. Does introducing DCT actually reduce the burden of the patients? That's the first aspect we need to understand. And most important, before that as well, the patient pool participating. For the diabetes trial probably, wherein we are just going to look at the HbA1c. I'm just trying to give a very simple example here, wherein we are just going to evaluate HbA1c. Probably it's easier to implement the home visits, etc., versus trying to implement for the oncology study. So we need to understand that. Also the category of patients, like, how ill the patient is and whether it really supports, the DCT might support it or might just add to the burden is something that we need to understand from the patient perspective. And also we need to have the understanding for the site implementation is what we have realized, like, reducing site burden is equally important. Like, introducing new technology might just, be overwhelming for the sites, as we have realized. It might be not easy, and at the same time, we also need need to understand whether the site has the capability and the facility to actually implement the DCT. So these are the few aspects we try to think over as a sponsor before we introduce DCT to a trial. I've just tried to put up a sample decision tree here. It's, I would say, like, it looks very simple, but the decisions are not so simple, I would say. So example, like, when you have a study, you evaluate, like, the study schedule of the assessment. Example here, I've just put a patient questionnaire. This is something that we think that, probably can be introduced. Can this be done remotely? The answer will be yes. This can be done independently by the patient, and it could be comfortable. And the next question is DCT the solution to it? So example here, patient questionnaire, ePro. ePro is the solution to it. So yes, DCT can help that. So that's how we come to that decision. And then we also need to understand the country regulation and the country feasibility that we have already spoken about. So can feasible countries implement this solution? Because even within countries, there are different, expectations or the regulations varying from country to country as well. And as a sponsor, we look at the EU regulation, we need to look at the FDA regulation as well as, the other countries as well, wherein the like HGR regulation, etc. So we need to adhere, implement all of the aspects to include the multi-country trials. So the answer has to be like, whether it serves that purpose, wherein we can include all of this. And again, the bigger question for internally for us is also that, is there an internal capability within the sponsor to do this, and whether we have the vendor identified. When we say capability, it includes a lot of different aspects, not just about resources in terms of people, in terms of money, etc. So I've just put up the example here, ePro. I'm stating ePro because this is something which majority of people from the site has implemented, so it's very relatable. So yes, we will have a vendor probably, and we can, use this. So there are a lot of complicated trackers, and there are a lot of metrics that we follow to even get into the decision whether this DCT can be implemented in a specific trial. I'll go to the benefits that we see as a sponsor here. One of it is productivity, I would say. Like, as I said, for us, the recruitment timeline, every day that is delayed is costing us. So we have seen with introduction of few technologies, we have been able to reduce the timeline in terms of the FPI, even the overall recruitment time that we have seen, screen failure and dropouts, because, sometimes at the screening, the patients get too overwhelmed with, sometimes the visits, like when it is about the oncology, the visits can be up to 6 to 7 hours, which is too much, and there is a lot of patient screen failure that we see. But again, when I have to put this in number, it still varies. Like, there are a lot of CROs, they are putting up the number in terms of the benefits, in terms of the percentages. The example, how much is the reduction in the FPI? There is a paper available on Google wherein they are talking about the reduction in the FPI timeline that has been reduced. But I would say this is differing still from the company to company, the CROs and the pharmas, where CROs who are exclusively into DCTs, and pharma wherein we are still trying to implement, customizing it per the study. So in terms of the evaluation of the benefits, there are different tools and metrics that we are using, and it's not yet standardized. And very important aspect that the DCT is serving for us is the clinical trial diversity. I touched based on this previously as well. And this is something, this is not right now mandate for the EU, but in terms of the FDA regulation, that it has become mandatory to add the plan in place and submit those plans in terms of how we are going to ensure the clinical trial diversity. And having DCT tools has helped us, at least have some plans in place on how we can include population. Benefits, it's of course the increased patient participation and engagement. I can give you a very simple example, like we spoke about the rare disease already. So rare disease, we have seen the patients have to travel internationally as well. They have to stay internationally for more than a week or so to get their treatment initiated, etc. DCT just, answers to a lot of aspects for them. Having the e-consent can really help them to, first initial discussion can really help them to understand whether the patient is really interested and how it works, and with the DTP, etc. So a lot of solutions that can be implemented really helps certain portfolio of the patients. Secondly, it's also about giving patient choices. Another example, like, DCT is not always about, having like really complicated elements being added, like e-consent or something. It can be as simple as, having some tool or some app that can help patient get reminder instead of, sites calling up the patients frequently. The patients can have the liberty of, planning their visits, they're making their travel arrangement just with the support of app. So that really helps. So empowering patients through technology really happens with the certain kind of elements that we can add. And it also keeps the patient engaged. Like, there are so many variables, and that really helps patient get real-time information, which also makes them, understand whether things, example again, diabetes, the variables really help that again, like, having real-time information on their glucose control. So these are the basic benefits that we do see in terms of the increased patient participation and engagement. There are other factors as well, of course. One is reduced cost and improved efficiency. Now, this is something I would not say completely a benefit. There are pros and cons to it. So I will add this to my risk section as well. So overall, we see that, if there is a simplified app or something is added, it does reduce the site workload and also reduce travel for the patients. And that, of course, translates into increased time and cost efficiency to run the trial. Another one, very important, is improved data quality and accuracy, like real-time monitoring of patient data and remote collection of vital signs and other health metrics, as I already spoke about. So this is something that we get, which we were not able to get through the comprehensive previous traditional trial that we used to do. So overall, as in terms of the potential impact of the DCT on drug development and industry as whole, I would say it does lead to the faster drug development, reduced trial cost, increased patient participation, as I said, and improved data quality and accuracy, and geographic reach. The last point is something that I would also like to highlight, is the reduced impact on the planet. Like, as a sponsor as well, we are trying to ensure the CO2 emission by the organization is minimum. So DCT with some virtual information that we try to add, that can also help reduce the impact on the planet. So that's the perspective that we also look at. Let's look at the other side of it. So there was one survey which was done, which this was done with the sponsors, including the, I would say there were GCP quality and risk in the DCT aspect. So there were quality people involved to understand what are the risks with the DCT. And this is only from the industry perspective. So there were 9 parameters here. This one is a very basic graph. The next one gives a lot of insight. But just to explain what is there in here. So there are different components of the DCT. Example, the first one you see is telemedicine and virtual visits. There is home health service. There is e-consent, DTP. So 9 modules of DCT has been captured. And the risk also, if we see, so there were risks that we used for the scoring was the patient safety and welfare, patient's right and privacy, data integrity and credibility, oversight, documentation of regulatory compliance. So when we were trying to, when this risk evaluation or the survey was done, one thing was clearly observed, that there is no clear consensus among the sponsors as well about the risk identification. Like, it ranged from 0 to 4 in terms of the risk response that they had provided. The next one gives more clarity on how they are looking at the risk. So here you see that average risk across the respondents by DCT modality and risk type again. So we see that no DCT modalities are off limits, like not with high risk, but at the same time, none are without the risk as well. So if we like to look at the trend, example, let's look at the telemedicine and virtual visits. What we see is patient safety and welfare amongst the responder is the highest risk that we see. With the e-consent, we see that patient's right and privacy is at high risk. Again, similar something that we observe with the remote patient monitoring as well, wherein data integrity and credibility as risk. So there are risks to each of the components is what the identification is. And overall, when we look at the average risk by DCT modality, seems like telemedicine and virtual visit seems to be the highest risk that we see in terms of the implementation, and lowest is on-demand technology support for the patients. Moving again with the challenges, this is something at the sponsor end as well we struggle, and it's more of a mindset change that we also need to bring in. First part is the patient consent. Like, patient consent, I'm not talking about e-consent, I'm talking about just adding the components that will ensure that the patient is fully aware what is the data that is going to be captured. Example, the IP address, if they're going to be using an app, etc. So what data is going to go from their end and whether patients have consented for it is very important. And we really struggle to actually, with the DCT coming in, if we are introducing something, we need to ensure that patient has consented for that specific app. So we need to explicitly mention those in our consent. The other three aspects is data protection, data ownership, and data sharing. Like, the encryption of data is really important. Data ownership. So it's for the patient is the owner of the data, and we need to ensure after the study is completed as well, the ownership remains with the data, with the patient. So these are the factors that we need to build in while we are, introducing DCT, and this is still a challenge. And data sharing, like, we need to have the scope of work clearly mentioning about who will be having the data, how we are going to share it, and at the end, regulatory compliance. Like if you're doing a multi-country study, like we are supposed to regulate like GDPR guidelines as well as HIPAA guidelines. So everything needs to be added here. So that's something we need to ensure, and we see this is a challenge because this is evolving and there is a lot of uncertainty here. Another is addressing technological and logistical barrier. And I'm just going to focus on the sponsored digital education here. We know patients and sites are evolving, but as a sponsor, like when we are implementing, we see we need to upgrade ourselves. We cannot just work with a typical model or typical way of, this is how my monitoring plan was, and I will just create something from that typical template. That thought process is gone. We need to identify what are the risks coming with sharing the data on the platform, and accordingly the monitoring has to be customized. So there is a lot of learning at the sponsor level as well we need to do. Second is technology. Like technology, we need to also, the best of the technology probably might not work if it is not easy. So we need to see that, in terms of the adoption, in terms of the accessibility, reliability, and simplicity of technology is something that we need to ensure. And same thing is with the logistic and the technical support. Like, DTP seems to be easy, but in terms of, ensuring the smooth running and having the patients on time, reaching the IP on time to the patient is really critical. So we are evolving with all of this, I would say. Other is, as I mentioned, the cost-benefit analysis. Like, it's still a cornerstone, I would say. Like, there's no clear benefit or no profit or loss that we can talk about. But right now, so this is being addressed, and we have a lot of technology partners who are expert, and we take expert help. And last, not the least, and the most important is the human touch, of course. This is the challenge with the DCT, of course, too much of, phone, the apps, etc. Technology disrupts the day-to-day activity, and that is something that we need to also look at when we are implementing it for the patients, and less face-to-face time with the physicians. I would say with a sponsor perspective as well, as you know, the clinical trial landscape is rapidly changing, but we do see the support from the regulatory framework. It's evolving, and we have, like the recent one, the most recent one is the FDA draft guidance as well that has been received in May 2023. So it seems that, and it is the understanding that regulatory is in acceptance. Again, all of us are evolving and trying to learn and trying to make this better is what I would say. I've just put up, since EU guidelines were covered, I thought I will just add the FDA because this is the latest, but I will not talk much about it, but it does help with 3 parameters here: application for technologies in DCT, consideration of investigator oversight, and preserving data integrity. So this is something that is addressed in the FDA guidance as well now. There are a lot of resources and tools for the new, smaller pharma companies or the new setup or in terms of the individual researchers as well. There are a lot of non-profit organizations that are into it, And I would say for EU, we have the IMI trials at home, but there are others as well, which is Translate Biopharma, because as a sponsor as well, we need that common platform to understand what are the practices that are being added. So there is Translate, there is DTRA, there is SCRS. So these are if you go to their websites, there are a lot of training and toolkits available on how to implement. There are checklists available, so that can be useful. Again, there are a lot of initiatives, the clinical trial transformation initiatives. It actually talks about, what technology, example in e-consent, what's the accuracy, how we can adapt it. So there are a lot of initiatives in that way that really helps you make the sound decision whether, DCT can be implemented. We do have some success stories. I will just take a very basic example of the Sanofi telecare diabetes trial, not about a very complicated DCT model implemented, but it was just about the telemedicine. And it really, what was observed in these two groups is the group receiving telemedicine services showed significantly better glycemic control to those without telemedicine services. The trial highlighted the powerful benefits of DCT through technology such as telephone communication services. But all said and done, it depends upon trial to trial. It also depends upon the endpoint, so there are various factors to it. Just to highlight the impact of the clinical trial trends, this is something from the Status Insight that I have tried to adapt. What we see is DCT is just one of the aspects in terms of the innovation. There are a lot of other aspects as well which are being explored by the pharma, and what you see is in the future, of course, blockchain is there, the 5G is there, cybersecurity, wearables, cloud computing. So the potential is endless, I would say, and this is just the start of it. DCT is just one of the components. And this is something I just tried to put up in terms of the DCT market growth. This is from the CAGR, and we do see the exponential progression over the time. Almost the last slide for me. So sponsor requirement. Most of it is covered by Dite, I would say, and this is something I have as well, early engagement of the patient is really important to implement and understand the DCT. Secondly, the change in the mindset, as I said, we can't work with the traditional model. We need to have people, if you're working at a pharma and if you're going to outsource, it cannot be that, everything is dependent upon, or you can just rely on the CRO. You need to have that in-house capability to understand where your data is going, whether your data is ensured. To have that in-house capability is really important. So pharma has started having a lot of, digital people in recruitment, I would say. Redefining process and workflow. Oversight was already discussed, so I'm not going to talk about it. And of course, integrating the quality and risk management plan and data ownership and security. These are few parameters as a pharma for the study setup, I would say, is the mindset that you require to have. Takeaways, I would say, DCT adoption is on rise, but there is still hesitance to a full decentralized model, I would say. We are still moving in the hybrid model. Emerging technologies, patient-focused trial designs, and adaptive trial design is the future. I would say there is a positive support from the regulators, but what is important is education and change management, and that is going to be critical to success, I would say. And as I already touched base, education is both for the sponsor, patient, and sites. And as we have realized that early engagement of regulators and patient is key in implementation of DCT, and ensure the data privacy and patient consent. With this, I would say, future is innovation, future is patient centricity, DCT is part of it. But at the same time, I would just like to quote that as the world becomes a more digital place, we cannot forget about the human connection. This is from Adam Newman, and it actually makes sense that we are dealing with patients at the end of the day, and that has to be the center of our strategies that we implement. Thank you.
Actually, that was terrific, very comprehensive oversight. Thank you very much for that. And some of those things you mentioned, we shouldn't forget the planet. Healthcare has largely sort of gone under the radar as far as carbon emissions are concerned. But actually, it's, the eye is now turning to health systems, which many countries are responsible for 5% of their carbon emissions. So, it's really very significant. So that's something, and the diversity which you mentioned again. One other thing is about apps.
Yeah.
So medical apps, there is a wild west, is there not, of medical apps? And whilst in these decentralized trials, the patient's data is their own, what you're seeing in a lot of medical apps is the patient's data is run away with. They've taken the data. I mean, for instance, in diabetes, where there's a lot of apps available, they just run off with all the data. And it's going to be quite difficult to establish that in trials, patients' data is safe, when clearly in a lot of apps, it's not safe.
It's not safe, yeah. So that's what, this is something that we need to evaluate, like we need to have those vendors who can provide us surety about how this data is going to be stored by them, how it is going to be handed over by us. So this is something that we try to negotiate and discuss and put it as a clause, so later on if there is any breach, we can always contact. So this is something that we are trying to do. But at the same time, as I said, we are also learning, like, so we are, at the end of the day, we are more of a science experts and not the digital experts. We are bringing in experts from outside to understand this. But at the same time, as I said, like the whole mindset has to change in terms of how I am reviewing my documents, or even the scope of work or the agreements with the person, with the app builder, basically. So that at the end of the day, we can claim or we can ensure basically that the patient's data is secured.
Now, one of the things we saw with COVID is that there was increasing collaboration between pharma companies. That was very welcome. Please tell me that every pharma company is not developing its own app and its own digital solution for decentralized trials.
Now, it's not the case. There are few. So it also depends upon study and the complexity of the study. I can give a very simple example to the audience. Like when we are even building the patient questionnaire or the ePro, which is on the app these days, there is a lot of thought process. I would say almost 6 months of brainstorming that happens to exactly place the right questionnaire, the right disclaimer, and also the right visits, because one mistake that we make or error that we make in terms of not aligning it to the right visit can reach to a situation where we will not be able to have the right endpoint data collection. So those are the factors. Like it takes a lot, I would say, in terms of building that and validating it. And it's not, so there are preferred vendors, and it's not that we just go by the data or the apps which are just going well. So there are a lot of, I would say, the 3PM technologies that we need to use to ensure there is a lot of due diligence done with the vendor before we even give them a contract. So that's
lots of collaboration.
Background information.
That's what we like to hear.
Yes.
Any questions in here? Have we got anything online? Just a thought from you before we break.
Yeah, so we have a lot of questions related to the implementation of new technologies, and so whether there is a challenge with GDPR. So this is one of the first question, and whether then you need to have, you already touched a little bit validated platform, and because you store some patient data, and also how you ensure that it's not introducing also a bias on patient selection. So
yeah. So I would say that we, generally for most of the pharmas, it happens that we have a preferred partners when it comes to the implementation of DCT as well. Like it's not overnight. When we have a study, we decide that okay, we'll just implement this, and these are the options that we have. We do a lot of due diligence and have preferred partners in place, wherein we have already done our work in terms of whether they have the ensured processes like data integrity and the encryption basically, which is really important. So that's something we try to ensure. Yes, GDPR requirement as well as the HIPAA requirements needs to be covered when we are doing the multi-country studies. So we do, as I said, there is a big checklist that we have. We put up like example, we are doing this in 10 countries. We might have 5 countries where it is acceptable, but 2 countries where it is not acceptable. So overall, we need to weigh the risk or pros and cons with it, and then eventually decide if majority works as a pros, and then we can implement this technology is what we say.
And just a word about the patient bias, because it's something that we've touched on before, that these decentralized trials are both an aid to increasing diversity, but also potentially decrease diversity if they exclude populations that, for instance, don't have access to broadband.
Correct. So as I said, that one size does not fit all is something that is with the studies as well. You cannot say that, okay, in my study I will have the DCT. It depends really on the patient pool. Like, if it is diabetes and it's a very simple app, we can include patients from all across and patients have the knowledge of the basic apps. But when you're going to have a very complicated app or where you're having patients wherein, they are at a very poor health, we need to take that into consideration even before implementing the DCT. So from me, my take is it cannot be that we just say, okay, let's implement the DCT. It's not going to happen. There are these factors that needs to be evaluated so that we have patient inclusion and there's no biasness to it.
Terrific. Ekta, thank you very much.